Christian Brose, president of Anduril, joins China Talk. He's the author of The Kill Chain and spent a career on the Hill working under Senator McCain and as the SASC staff director.
You guys are building a factory in Ohio. Why isn't it under a mountain?
Not as many mountains in Ohio.
Find a state with mountains.
Yes.
Yeah. Why are we not building factories in places that can't be blown up easily?
Ohio is definitely on the list of places that cannot be blown up easily. It's inland. It's in a good location. I don't think this needs to be a deeply buried target necessarily. If we've got foreign adversaries that are bombing the American mainland and our production facilities, like I think we crossed into really bad territory a long time ago.
Fair enough. Speaking of being afraid of catastrophic homeland attacks, what Israel did to Iran, what Ukraine was able to do to Russian bombers, I don't think is something that has like completely sunk in here. I don't know, how freaked out should folks be about that sort of drone attack?
I mean, I don't want people to lose sleep over it on the daily, but they should be freaked out about it. I think we're living on borrowed time in this regard. I think we're looking at in the proliferation of low-cost drones, the ability to do a homemade drone with explosives integrated, a very similar thing to what the Ukrainians or the Israelis have done, and orchestrate a similar type of attack in the United States against a critical military target or other types of targets. I think that is imminently in the realm of the possible. I think that it is a 9/11 style problem that we are still adopting a September 10th mindset to. I think that those types of attacks have been to a degree a wake-up call for those who weren't already awake to this problem a long time ago. I do think that there's a lot more energy from the U.S. government kind of going into really thinking through, what do we need to do to get ourselves secure on the homeland against these kinds of like very proliferated potential drone attacks.
What does actually being serious look like?
Being serious is at first recognizing the vulnerability we have rather than sort of hand waving it away. I think that people are becoming serious in that regard. And then it's just moving with urgency to solve the problem. There's obviously going to be a funding component of that where you're going to need to buy capability and get it fielded to the critical sites that you need to defend. And there's just an enormous amount of, policy and bureaucracy that's going to have to be settled and or broken through in order to do this. So, for example, when you look at, counter drone in the United States, there are multiple different government agencies that own different parts of the airspace. They have policy control over different functions in terms of what you can do to defend against assets from aerial attack. Typically, this has resulted in paralysis, government agencies and congressional committees fighting with one another and yelling at one another, but not really kind of resolving a way to solve it. I think that the real challenge is going to be, can we bust through all of that, kind of policy and bureaucratic, logjam and actually start getting solutions fielded in an integrated way that protect the places that need to be most protected.
An Andrew Marshall quote on the development of new sources of military advantage. The most important goal is to be the best in the intellectual task of finding the most appropriate innovations in the concepts of operation and making organizational changes to fully exploit technologies already available and those that will be available in the next decade or so. And a quote from Anduril co-founder Brian Schiff talking to Ben Thompson on Stratechery. I think the fundamental thing that has to be true is that we have independent conviction on what the right answers are. And I know that as we've scaled, when we have a business unit that doesn't have that, the results are trash and it's obvious that they don't have the vision. What is the right division of labor between the government and the private sector for imagining the futures that Andrew Marshall was alluding to?
So I think to go back to the Marshall quote, which I agree with, but I could also argue the inverse of that, which he's kind of saying organizational and operational change enables government or the military to harness technological innovation and change. I think that's true. I also think the reverse is true, which is unless and until you have real technological change and adoption of new technology, it's very difficult for the government to understand and sort of envision new ways of operating and organizing. So I think the division of labor in that regard is the government will understand its problems. I think to the greatest extent possible, they need to rely upon private companies, innovators, people who are thinking creatively about different types of solutions, who understand the available technologies that many in the government don't fully understand or appreciate, and how they can be combined together into solutions that well-meaning people writing military requirements might not necessarily come up with on their own. I think the role of the government then in that regard is taking those new capabilities and doing what they uniquely need to do, which is figuring out new ways of operating and organizing themselves to take maximum advantage of what these new capabilities offer, and genuinely present new types of dilemmas to the adversary. Like, industry can't do that for them. I think the best that industry can do is set them up and enable them with new capabilities, additional capacity, basically kind of other predicates that open up the opportunity for them to really rethink how they operate and organize.
But this is a new dynamic, the one that Anduril, the defense tech sector at large, is saying. 30, 40 years ago, this would all be happening in-house, more or less.
In the government?
Yes.
Yes and no. I think, look, you could even argue that less of this was happening in-house 30 or 40 years ago. I think we've gone through this period in the U.S. where we had an incredibly vibrant industrial base, a defense industrial base. Back during the World War II and the early and mid Cold War, late Cold War, and really what we've seen over the past generation is this hyper consolidation, post Last Supper, things that people have talked about, that has really created something that has never existed in the United States from an industrial base standpoint, which is a hyper concentration of defense manufacturing and development in basically like 5 or 6 companies. That is very, opposed to the way our industrial base has traditionally functioned, where the government had a lot more diversity, a lot more partners, a lot more competition, a lot more pressure for innovation that was happening in the private sector, because there was very much a, perform, survive or die, type approach. Whereas, really since the 1990s, it's been, kind of a bunch of companies that are too big to fail. And, the results of that are things that are now becoming very apparent to people.
I guess I'm curious, staying on this, for your sense of where the new doctrine comes from. You wrote about this in your book about how, look, at the end of the day, most people have, when you're talking great powers, people have roughly equal toys, and it's how you use them that ends up providing you the edge in a new, military revolution or whatever, just new age of combat. Right. And it seems like what Anduril and this new defense ecosystem is envisioning is playing more of an active role in imagining what that doctrinal future is than maybe defense contractors were 20 or 40 years ago.
Yeah, I think that because we're at the cutting edge of technology, we absolutely understand the capabilities that we're building and providing, but then the opportunities that does open up to operate differently and to structure and organize the military differently. We're going to be less opinionated on those operational and organizational questions, just because that is clearly the domain of the government. And to answer your question directly, I think the new ideas and the really kind of game-changing ideas for operational and organizational change will come from the government and the military. And in my experience, will come typically from lower levels, not necessarily kind of higher levels. It is more of an organic bottom-up type of innovation, as opposed to someone on high whose first name is secretary or chief mandating that the organization change. But what I wrote about in my book and still believe to this day is that you have to have both together. Oftentimes when you have bureaucratic disruptors, people in government who are seeking to change, down at a lower level, if they don't have the top cover from political leadership, from military leadership, they tend to get squashed. At the same time, you've seen many examples of well-meaning political leaders or military leaders who want to change their institution. They have a vision of where it needs to go, but they can't bring the organization in line to follow them, and to really get this adopted in a way that when they roll out of their job in 2 or 3 years, it stays. So I think on the government side, there really needs to be an empowering of lower-level disruptors, operational leaders, and commanders who are going to oftentimes push those novel ideas up. But you need change agents at the top who are looking for those people and looking for those ideas and really trying to drive it through.
you had this very kind of striking line in the conclusion of Kill Chain, which is now, oh my God, 5 years old. It is hard to escape the conclusion that America is still not serious.
Yeah.
How has the balance of serious versus not serious across different universes of organizations and people for whom the things that Andrew Marshall was referring to is relevant to their jobs, how's that changed over time?
Let's first determine what we mean by serious. What I mean by serious is judged not by what people say, but by what they do. In terms of actions they're taking, money they're moving, programs they're starting, whatever the metric is. When I wrote my book, what little research I did for it as I looked back in, kind of recent decades, it was shocking how many people have been saying more or less similar things to what I wrote in my book. I mean, Andrew Marshall obviously being a top example of them. So it's not as if these are brand new ideas. I mean, they're things in many cases that we've been talking about for 30 years now. What's shocking is how often we have failed to do the very things that we said were necessary and important. So to me, the definition of seriousness is, are we actually doing the things that we say we need to do? Are we actually changing, and are we doing it at scale? So not science projects and innovation theater, but genuinely changing our institutions. That is something that I think that we have made progress on in the past 5 years since I wrote the book. I think it's impossible to argue that we haven't made progress in that regard. And you can point to a lot of different examples and people and, things that have happened that, would suggest that we're moving in a more serious direction. Are we as a country, quote unquote, serious yet? No, I still don't believe that we are. I think that we're getting there. I think that there are people that you can point to who say like they get it and they're doing their level best with the powers that they have to be serious and change their organizations. But when I look at, for example, where we stand with the budget process, where the Department of Defense is on a full year continuing resolution, which means that they're locked into the budget from a year ago. They don't have a ton of flexibility in terms of what they're able to do. We can't agree as a country how much money we should be spending on defense, the ways in which we should be spending it, and that at the beginning of the fiscal year, the Department of Defense actually needs an appropriated budget so they can move out with the process of changing themselves. It's hard to argue that we as a country are serious when that kind of behavior is still happening and frankly becoming more mainstreamed. That's the kind of stuff that I would look at, one of many examples that I would look at as an indicator that if we were serious and we started to get our act together, that kind of stuff wouldn't happen. Because, I'm not an expert on the, Chinese Communist Party's budget process, but I'm pretty sure, that the Chinese military is getting its money at the start of their fiscal year.
Well, other problems they have as well. Let's get an executive branch one.
I think this counter drone example is a really good one. In terms of we are becoming more serious, but we're not there yet, right? I mean, we have massive vulnerabilities in this country. An Operation Spider's Web could absolutely 100% happen here today. I don't think it would actually be that difficult to orchestrate. So if we're continuing to remain vulnerable to that kind of an attack, really a 9/11 style surprise, violation of sovereignty, loss of life, loss of critical military assets, if we're still squabbling over the terms of policy and bureaucracy and different things, if we're not spending the money to a degree that we need to spend to solve this problem, if we're not leaning on new companies that are bringing new technologies and capabilities to bear, not just in demonstrations, but fielded, and perform it in operations, again, it's hard to argue that we're serious. But I think that there are people now that I can point to who are absolutely moving out with seriousness. And, look, there are many, just as a way of one example, I think, the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army should be commended for how much they are trying to do to change their organization. I mean, the Army is the largest military service, most people, most money, most things. It is a very difficult supertanker to turn around. And, in a matter of months, you have, two leaders, civilian and military, who are trying to cut away from old legacy capability that they don't need anymore, that are trying to reorganize themselves from a procurement and acquisition and technology adoption standpoint, that are rethinking how the Army needs to operate. I mean, there's nothing that's off the table there, and obviously the proof will be in the pudding and all of the the actions that need to follow. But there's an enormous amount that's been done already, and that's an example of how much committed and senior leaders can really change their organizations and adopt change for the better.
And closing Army museums as well. Make sure we aren't wasting time and money on those. William Murray and McGregor Knox wrote that revolutions in military affairs take place almost exclusively at the operational level of war. They rarely affect the strategic level, except insofar as operational success can determine the larger strategic equation, often a tenuous linkage. So revolutions in military affairs remain rooted in and limited by strategic dividends and by the nature of war. They are not a substitute for strategy, as so often assumed by the utopians, but merely an operational or tactical means. I think when people look at Ukraine and at the future of war in general, there is this bias to, I don't know, sell your thing, get attention, raise money, to envision something utopian or promise something that is like a complete game changer. But one of the big takeaways for me from Ukraine is that folks should have relearned the lesson already that like operational silver bullets don't exist, and you have this like wild dance where things are changing all the time, and whatever you started with is not what you're going to end up with 2 years later, much less 6 weeks later.
Right.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah. I guess maybe to go back to the quote, right? I do think there are examples of military technological revolutions that have strategic impact. I mean, nuclear weapons come to mind. I think a lot of what we're seeing in the kind of cyber domain is certainly something that has strategic implications when you start to look at the possibility for nation state, not the possibility, the reality of nation state adversaries deeply disrupting and destroying in many respects the fabric of the way of life of another country, because they can target critical infrastructure, they can target the lifeblood of what we in this country frankly take for granted on a day-to-day basis. And all of a sudden, if that stuff goes off, that has a strategic impact pretty significantly. There are probably other examples in terms of how AI and autonomy kind of speed up and increase the scale of warfare where it begins to take on a strategic implication. But I think your point about Ukraine is right. And I think it's something that America has had to learn. And it's been an eye-opening experience, right? I think for the past generation, we've assumed that we're so far ahead in terms of military technology that we can afford to have a very small number of very exquisite things that are going to do the work for us. And that if, God forbid, we find ourselves in a conflict, one, it's not going to last very long. We're not going to shoot many of those weapons. We're not going to lose a lot of things. We're not going to have to replace a lot of things. And we're not going to have to do that as a function of time. And that's been a bit of our lived experience. And I think Ukraine is much more of a back to the future type moment where you realize, no, actually, every war that we've fought has lasted a long time. Where we've ended up is not even remotely close to what we started with. And that pace of innovation and change and adaptation and learning is the whole game, right? It is how quickly can you understand the changing character of the battlefield, what your adversary is doing, what technology enables you to do, roll that into learning and development and fielding of new capability, operational and organizational change that comes from that, recognizing that all of the gains that you might be able to eke out are themselves going to be fleeting. And whether that's a matter of weeks or months or maybe a year, you're going to have to keep that cycle incredibly tight and incredibly fast. I think that we've frankly missed an enormous opportunity as a country to really think about Ukraine as a catalyst for changing the way we operate. The Department of Defense and the U.S. government in general, it deals with things that it plans for, and it deals with things that it doesn't plan for. And things that it doesn't plan for, in my experience, it generally wants to sort of like say, like, I didn't see this coming. I don't want to have to deal with this. I'd rather just get back to the regularly scheduled program. And I think that by and large, that's how we've addressed Ukraine. We have provided a lot of support over a few years. But we've largely just kind of grabbed things that were off the shelf, legacy programs of record, stockpiles of weapons, many of which have been very useful to them, many of which have been not useful in the least. But I think as a country, we've really missed an opportunity to recognize that in supporting this country, we have an opportunity to really adopt that pace of change ourselves, realize that this is the absolute, sort of frontier of warfare right now. And if we can't solve these problems for ourselves, let alone what they're going to look like, God forbid, in a China scenario, which is all 10x worse, we are going to find ourselves on the back foot if we end up in a conflict like that. And I think that there's a lot more we could have done in terms of really looking at this as a proving ground for new technologies and new capabilities that could not just help the Ukrainians win, but help the U.S. military change itself at scale with a lot more speed. We'll see. Maybe there's still an opportunity to do that. Don't know what the future holds, but I think in that regard, at the tactical and operational level, there's an enormous amount that's changing. And considering the parity that I think we're going to have, that we do have in a lot of respects with the Chinese military, if again, God forbid, we ever find ourselves in a conflict there, I think all of the assumptions of Ukraine apply. It's not going to be short in all likelihood. We are going to lose a lot of things. We're going to have to replace a lot of things, and we're going to have to change and adapt at a speed that we're really not used to as a country.
Let's talk about scale for a second. Another big lesson of Ukraine. We had a guest on a few weeks ago talking, who left the CIA. I was like, what's your favorite document? He goes, well, this thing's public. The Chinese, each province has like a war scaling exercise where they like get all the companies in the room and they like working stuff out of, okay, how are we gonna build 100x of this, 100x of that.
Right.
America did that like until 1947,
right.
And basically stopped. And it was very striking to me, another Brian Schiff quote about how this was something that you guys are explicitly planning when you think about building things, is finding partners that could go 100x or 10 or 100x. Reflections on that? Is this something that other people are going through their heads?
I mean, I can't speak for other people. I think the way we think about it is the amount of capability that the United States is going to have for a pure fight is probably an order of magnitude larger than what we have become used to or accustomed to over the past 30 years or so. And again, this isn't a new insight. I mean, if you go back to World War II, for example, we won that by outproducing our adversaries, and we were producing at a scale that was just eye-watering. I think really in the past 30 years or so, we've become enamored of this idea that we could basically build a military that is irreplaceable. That it would be small, it would be exquisite, it would be technologically bleeding edge. But because we were so far ahead of our competitors, if we ever had to fight, it was not going to last long. We weren't going to lose much. We weren't going to have to produce much or replace much. And that's just ahistorical in terms of what the experience of the United States at war has been since we were a country. So as we look at that problem, if the problem becomes, all right, how do I 10x or 20x production of vehicles and weapons, and not just do it once, but sustain it as a function of time for months and years, perhaps in mountains, perhaps in fields, perhaps on islands or at sea. I don't want to limit options in the future. Outer space, everything's on the table. But the real question becomes, how do you actually design capabilities to be mass produced? And I think if you look back at World War II, for example, that's what we were doing, right? You could take over the Willow Run automotive facility and go from making commercial cars and trucks to making B-24 bombers, because those bombers weren't wildly different than the commercial vehicles that were being built on those lines prior. It's impossible for me to believe that, a Ford factory today in Michigan could build B-21 long-range strike bombers. Like every aspect of it has just become completely different and divorced from commercial supply chains, manufacturing, et cetera. So I think when we kind of look at this problem, one, we accept that it is absolutely a doable thing. When Tesla entered the automotive industry, right, they were laughed out of the room, by Wall Street, by traditional automotive manufacturers. because the production targets that they were putting on the board and the speed with which they were claiming to be able to do it was just never been done before. Today, if you look at one of those Tesla gigafactories, they're producing 4,000 to 5,000 vehicles a week. And yet, when you look at the production that passes for quote unquote large scale, in the defense industrial base, it's a few hundred weapons a year. Maybe it's a few thousand weapons a year, but it's nowhere close to what commercial manufacturing is able to achieve. So when we look at that problem, the first premise needs to be you need to leverage as much of the commercial industry as you possibly can. You need to design weapons and military capability to be mass producible. And if you don't do that, there's no way at all downstream that you're going to solve that problem with more money or more feeling or anything else you might want to apply to it. So you have to, at the level of design, simplify it. You have to make conscious decisions to go lean on commercial manufacturers who have tons of capacity. And in the event of a war, could easily be at the direction of the government, flipped over from being 5% defense, 95% commercial, to the other way around. But if you're not making those choices at the beginning, one, you're never going to be able to produce at the scale that you want to. Two, you're never going to be able to sustain that over time. I think for us, whether it's autonomous fighter jets that we're building for the Air Force or robotic undersea vehicles or weapons of all kinds, I mean, that design principle is at the core of everything that we're doing. I think it's why we're going to be able to make good on the commitment that we've made or the promise that we've made that we'll be able to do 10x production of what typically passes for large scale production in the defense industrial base.
A provocation from Dan Wong's new book, Breakneck. AI can't distract us from broader American deficiencies. As relations between the U.S. and China become more hostile, the chances of a conflict grow. The U.S. is facing a peer competitor that has 4 times its population, an economy with considerable dynamic potential, and a manufacturing sector that can substantially outproduce itself and its allies. If China and the U.S. ever come to blows, they would be entering a conflagration with different strengths. What would you rather have, software or hardware?
It's a false choice. And I say this as a company that is, trying to be leading edge in both. I think that at the end of the day, you're going to need hardware. Right? There's just no two ways around it. So long as, human beings exist in the real world and, occupy physical space, hardware is going to continue to be relevant. At the same time, I think, what's really changing and what's different is that previously we'd always faced this choice between you could have mass, but it was going to be dumb, or you could have precision, but you weren't going to have quantities of it. And I think the real opportunity now is you can put those two things together and you can do it at an affordable price. So you can have low-cost weapons, low-cost drones that are also enabled by highly intelligent, highly capable software. So you get both mass and precision at an affordable price. And I think really what that does, putting aside US and China, is, it opens up the level of kind of geopolitical competition to countries that previously would not have had access to that level of throw weight in the international environment because they had been limited by size of territory, size of population, size of economy. And, what's happening now technologically, both in terms of software, AI, and autonomy, as well as in low-cost manufacturing and other kinds of production changes that are occurring, is the ability for a small country to actually punch enormously above its weight from the standpoint of military capability.
So we have the floor being raised, like precise mass or mass precision. We haven't decided yet.
Yes.
Lots more people can do our crazy drone attack on a waste treatment plant halfway across the world. But there's also what Dan was getting at is like, I believe that you're trying to make, production and supply chains that can go 10 or 20x, but it is hard to compete from that perspective with the world's factory, right? Yeah. What's going to have to give there?
Well, so, unless we're prepared to just kind of say at the outset, we've really dorked this up for the past 40 years and we might as well surrender. I think the question becomes, okay, you have to accept the reality of where you are. which I think people are starting to do, but it still seems the case that people haven't wrestled fully yet with the implications of what 40 years of essentially U.S. outsourcing and deindustrialization at a time of Chinese hyperindustrialization has really kind of brought us to. The shipbuilding example is a good one that's often used. 220 times the capacity shipbuilding, in China relative to the United States. We get into a conflict and we start losing ships, this is going to be a really hard problem for us to solve. So I don't think the answer is, go back in time and try to recreate a bunch of old industrial muscle that we've lost. I think the answer is, it's what we're trying to do. It's what a lot of other new companies are trying to do, which is try to create new and different muscle that can actually be put in place much faster. So, as I look at where we are as a company, I mean, we have millions of square feet of production capacity that are coming online, all over the United States in allied countries. And it's happened in a matter of, a couple of years, really. And the ability to scale that as we become a larger company, as other companies become larger, it's just that those factories are going to have to be building different things, right? They're not going to be building aircraft carriers and destroyers and long-range strike bombers. They're going to be building autonomous fighter jets and robotic submarines and low-cost cruise missiles and drones and other things that can be built that quickly, where you have a workforce that is skilled enough to be able to mass produce those kinds of things in the United States. So, I think the answer is we are absolutely in a bad way. From a hardware and manufacturing capacity standpoint, we have given up an enormous advantage in this country, and China has absolutely seized that. So we are where we are. That being said, I don't for a moment believe that all hope is lost. Going back to your point, if we are serious, there's an ability to create new production capacity in this country to mass produce the kinds of military systems that we're going to need to generate and sustain deterrence. And if we end up in a conflict, God forbid, to be able to fight it, sustain it, and win it over time.
Coming up to the strategic level, I guess another way to answer China's ability to manufacture is, as you alluded to, getting the rest of the world on board as well. You wrote pretty compellingly that on the one hand, it would be nicer for allies to do more and spend more money, but let's not forget that they are actually allies. It's been a weird few months. I think we've seen Europe say they want to spend more, but also say they want to, have their own homegrown stuff. Take this wherever you want to bring it.
It has been an interesting few months, right? I think there's been an enormous amount of change. I mean, obviously, everything that's happened, on the tariff side and politically and otherwise. It has created tension. It has upended, a lot of people's understanding of kind of existing practices and orders. But the sky isn't falling, right? I mean, I think it's actually kind of an interesting setup for, all right, we have made a break with the past. We have made it very clear in the United States to the business community, to others in government, to our allies and partners abroad, that we are moving away from the last kind of order or arrangement. And there's a lot about that order and arrangement that wasn't great. So the whole question then becomes, well, what happens next? And I think you can look at the commitments that are being made in Europe to increase defense spending, which are considerable, right? I mean, it was part of executive branches and governments that, went over and dutifully read the talking points to the NATO allies that they really needed to increase defense. And, some of them did it and most of them didn't. Now it appears that they are actually doing it with seriousness. And I think the administration deserves a lot of credit for that. It's also not surprising that the European governments, particularly with all of this change and uncertainty, are thinking that they really want that investment to primarily go to creating sovereign and sort of homegrown capability that they, well, one, is going to employ their people. It's going to, kind of enrich them, but also they will know that they have it to rely upon, right? They're not necessarily dependent upon, others. At a time where the United States is speaking similar words, it's not surprising to hear that coming out of Europe as well. I think that still means that there's opportunity for U.S. companies, right? And I think we are navigating that the same as others where, okay, if it doesn't mean that we're just going to, produce things out of American factories and ship them to Europe, if that's increasingly not what our European allies are looking for, politically problematic or something else, well, there are a lot of other ways to do this, right? I mean, we are collaborating actively with major European defense companies like Rheinmetall. We are setting up our own indigenous operations in foreign allies and partners, and genuinely becoming part of their industrial base in the same way that, when I look at a Rolls Royce or a BAE, sure, they're British companies, but I mean, they're as much a part of the American industrial base as, Boeing or Lockheed Martin at this point. So it's possible to really leverage, and I think this is the premise of your question, the great advantage that the United States has in a dense network of allies and partners that are bound together by common interests and values. But the question that's always bedeviled us is, how do we operationalize that to operate at scale, to really kind of multiply the power of all of these countries to generate, kind of an offsetting mass to China, for example. That is something that I think is imminently possible right now with all of this churn, with all of this kind of acceptance that we're not going back to the past. We're going to have to build something new and different for the future. That's the piece that I'm sort of, eagerly awaiting, sort of action out of the government to really kind of chart a path for how we can collaborate, with our main allies and partners in Asia and Europe. It's going to look different than it historically has. That's okay. But I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity for those of us who are thinking creatively and looking to move aggressively at a time where people are really trying to get serious and solve problems.
Speaking of sovereign capability and things looking different than they did before, how do you feel about nationalizing primes and putting the Defense Department on the Anduril cap table?
So it's an interesting question and a fascinating debate that I never thought we'd be having, but here we are. Couple of thoughts. I think first and foremost, I absolutely understand why the U.S. administration is saying this. For years and years and years, you've had a handful of hyper-consolidated defense companies that entirely kind of rely upon government contracts for their existence. They have performed quite well on certain things, and they've performed pretty dismally on a lot of other things. The government has always owned the consequences of those outcomes. When a program is late, when it's over budget, the government is there with money. They don't have an ability to kind of go elsewhere because the market has become such that you can even call it a market. So hyper consolidated, so kind of wrought with like too big to fail, type players that the government doesn't really have options. So they end up owning all of the pain and the downside without really having the level of the kind of agency to kind of drive and demand performance that I think that they would want. So for the government to come in and say, all right, if you want me to build you, another facility to produce more, if you want, me to do this, that, or the other thing kind of new in addition right now, I want a piece, right? I want to be at your board, at your table with a real voice for how you're running the company, how you're using profits, how you're structured, this, that, or the other thing. So I totally get why this is a conversation that we're having. Now, I believe that doing this would actually be catastrophically bad at this present moment. One, this isn't like, I think the analogy of, what the government is doing with Intel, for example, is very different, right? I mean, Intel is a commercial company, providing for the commercial market. In the defense sector, we're talking about a monopsonistic environment where the government itself is the only buyer of what these companies are selling. So having the government providing contracts to a company that it itself is a part owner of and receiving effectively benefit for that company receiving that contract and doing well, I think is a massive conflict of interest, right? It's why we have requirements for civilians who are going in to be nominated and confirmed to be Secretary of Defense, for example, that they have to divest their major holdings in major defense companies so that they're not sitting up in the Secretary of Defense's office awarding contracts to companies that they're shareholders in. I think that it would be doubly bad and doubly ironic for this to happen at this particular moment because you have, over the past several years, this explosion of energy in this defense technology ecosystem, right? You have the emergence of dozens and hundreds of companies that didn't exist before that are being capitalized by billions of dollars of private money not government money, that are working at risk, that are innovating at risk. They are not receiving dollars from the US government for their research and development. They are building new products. They are building new capability. They are investing in themselves. They are standing up factories and facilities, employing Americans, all because they want to get into the defense industrial base. They want to make it more dynamic, more competitive, more innovative, better. So at a time where you have all of these companies rushing in, excited to do this work, finally, right, after a generation of effectively walking away, it would be deeply ironic to see the government take effectively an ownership stake in the largest companies that many of, us in many cases are competing against. So, in an environment where that didn't exist, right, and you effectively had hyper consolidated, large defense companies that you could count on one hand, and that's all you've got. It would make sense for the government to say, in order to compel performance, in order to keep programs on cost, on schedule, et cetera, I want to have more agency over how these companies are functioning. I get that. But at this time where you have all of this energy and money and talent rushing into the defense industrial base to make it competitive again, I think that kind of an action would be really problematic and a huge conflict of interest, again, in this weird, unique, monopsonistic market that is national defense.
Future of command and control. What won't humans be doing? I guess what will humans still be doing maybe 5, 10, 20 years down the road?
Well, I think, first of all, it's interesting to separate command and control, right? They get bundled together. They're often referred to as C2. Command and control are very different things, right? And I think when I think about it in sort of a human setting, you have commanders who are providing commander's intent to subordinate agents, whether those are people or in the future could be robotic systems. Those commanders are not telling them every single thing to do, right? I think they have certain subordinates who they might trust more, and they're willing to give them a wider berth or kind of more flexibility in terms of the things that they're able to do. But those commanders are providing the left and right limits under which the forces that kind of report to them are making decisions and operating. That control then is really executed more down at the, at that subordinate level. There are instances where a commander will reach down and directly control an outcome because it's important for that individual or for the mission. But the way the U.S. military functions is very much around delegation of authority to the lowest level. It's what makes us different, than the Chinese military or the Russian military. And I think it's a massive superpower. So this delegation of authority is the whole basis of command and control, which is why I actually don't think that it's crazy at all to take that exact framework and apply it to how human beings in the future will be interacting with robotic systems or autonomous systems, where you still have a human commander in charge, who is fundamentally making a couple of big decisions. One is determining whether some object on the battlefield is a legitimate military target. That is something that I think we want a human being deciding. A decision may be enabled by a lot of technology, sensors, and machine learning, but at the end of the day, a human being needs to say, yes, that is a legitimate military target that I want to do something about. And then I think the follow-on action of the doing something about it, the controlling or sort of initiating an act of violence is something that we're going to want a human being to at least say, this is a decision that I want to take. My own view is sort of to the left and to the right of that, and sort of beneath it. Most of this can actually be automated. It can be a set of practices or robotic systems that human beings can still execute command, but be more reliant upon autonomous systems or processes to engage in the control of the decisions that they're setting themselves.
Waymo, right? Everyone has this vision. The pitch they're making is, look, this is better than 99.9% of drivers, or it'll get there soon, so you should trust us instead of driving. There is a long and storied history of targeting decisions gone awry. Why do you think there should be human beings deciding which, Venezuelan boats to blow up?
Yeah, to be clear, I think what we're saying is a human being is going to have to make the decision that It's almost more of a classification decision, right? It is absolutely going to be enabled by technology, but making a determination that this is a civilian versus that is a legitimate military target. I'm not sure we're ready to hand that decision off to robots. But the thing I would tell you is I think that most of these decisions, all of these decisions, are highly contextual and circumstantial. And I find the debate often becomes this very monolithic debate of like, in the abstract, what are we willing to delegate to robots? So by way of an example, this conversation would look very differently if we're talking about offense or defense. If we're talking about a defensive operation where you have threats inbound, enemy drones, weapons, missiles, and you're trying to protect human life on a ship or on a military base or in a city, you are going to take a lot more risk. You're going to delegate a lot more because the speed in which you have to make that decision is much faster. The requirements are much faster. And the consequences of being wrong are much higher in terms of actual loss of life to your own forces or population. I think on the other side of it, if you are in the force projection business, if you are going out into the world to find enemy targets and destroy them, we are going to be, I think, as a country, more cautious and more circumspect about what we are delegating to autonomous systems or processes to go out and do on their own, absent some level of human on a loop supervision. Another example, the way the U.S. military operates is not we're going to go fight wars that are, endless in time and space. We are going instead to identify very specific geographic locations that we are going to define as areas of active hostility. I mean, this is U.S. military doctrine, it's law. So inside of these very kind of carefully drawn areas of active hostility, commanders will relax the threshold for using force because of risk to mission, risk to force. So it's absolutely, again, I think a set of ideas and sort of policy and doctrinal framework that can be adopted to how we think about using autonomous systems in combat, where it's not going to be loose the killer robots always and everywhere for all time. It's, hey, in a very specific geographic area, am I willing to essentially communicate to the rest of the world, which is the whole purpose of this, don't go here because I am treating this as a battlefield. And then what I am communicating to my own forces is you have a lot more leeway to use force or employ weapons that you might otherwise not be employing in different locations and contexts. Because again, you need the mission to be successful and you need to protect the human beings who are operating there, both military and civilian, for what it's worth.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it seems there seems to be a lot of competitive pressure in delegating more. Maybe this is like the tech isn't ready there. This is like a 2040 or 2050 thing. But I guess when you have your autonomy, which like does stuff that spins up to have strategic impacts you may not want to have, then that's probably where you still want to have.
Yeah, and like to be very clear about this, like that pressure is there, right? I think if militaries see an operational advantage to be gained by delegating more to autonomous systems, removing human control that slows processes down, if it enables them to operate at larger scales, because you can now have a human to machine relationship or ratio that enables one human being to deploy or supervise lots of robots or weapons. Countries are going to do that, and I would say China especially is going to do that because they're, to the extent that I understand it, and you're the expert on this, not me. I mean, their entire military structure is based on the belief that senior leaders do not trust their subordinates. They do not want empowered lower levels with guns running around with their own ideas and opinions. So it's not a huge logical leap for me to believe that the Chinese military, as a matter of doctrine, is going to be far more willing to delegate these kinds of decisions to robots that they believe they can control, as opposed to human beings who may have a mind of their own in terms of a group of folks who are armed who decide that they might not want to follow orders, or they might not like the regime, or they might want to take matters into their own hands.
I'm not sure how you spent your Tuesday night, but China parade takes. I've got one from the Peanut Gallery. Their CAAs seem much bigger and some are tailless compared to the Fury.
So I'll be very honest. I've been too busy this week to read deeply into, all of the, kind of moment by moment takes of like what's been coming through. Look, the Chinese Communist Party puts on a hell of a parade. So hats off. It was super impressive. The marching is very high level. I did not have a chance to see, every piece of military system rolling through. I'll offer an opinion that I think is kind of, to me, this is kind of the question that I have, right? Um, the benefit of these things, right, is you get to showcase your hardware, and it's all really interesting. And when we think of arms control and verification, it's all again very much built around this idea of I can see things in the real world, I can observe them, I can count them. This is how we did arms control with the Soviet Union. How many warheads do you have? We're doing open skies observations of deployed nuclear forces, et cetera. How do you verify the level of autonomy of a robotic system, right? How do you verify what the software of that system enables that, drone or robotic submarine? That is a massive operational advantage for a country, right? I mean, their collaborative combat aircraft are probably not going to look wildly different than ours. Their fighter jets certainly don't, because they have a very long and effective history of, stealing those designs from the United States. So if you see two drones that look more or less alike, one of them may have a level of that is 10x better, right? That enables it to do wildly more things in operations than the other identical to it. How do you verify that? I mean, how do you understand what its capabilities and limitations are? And it's certainly, how do you begin to even think about, which I know many people want to think about, an arms control regime for these types of capabilities? I look, I mean, I don't want to poo-poo the idea of arms control, and to the extent that we didn't have to get into an arms race type of dynamic, I think we'd all be better off. But I think the reality that people have to contend with is this is an incredibly difficult set of technology to observe, to verify, to understand what it's capable of doing, and what the military advantages that each respective country is gaining from those technologies are, which makes me just, very, I would say, kind of realistic, cynical about the prospects for getting into some type of arms control regime on AI-enabled systems or autonomous systems for those reasons.
Yeah, and that's kind of the lesson of the 60s, 70s, and 80s as well. Is it's like, okay, you kind of had arms control, but like it was on stuff that didn't matter because both countries could still totally blow each other up. And by the way, you had SALT, and then SALT ended like 3 years later, and you tried to do it again. And everyone is still trying to make new and better tanks and bombers and fighters at the same time. So share your pessimism on this one.
There's a lot of time that gets spent on thinking about, arms control for AI, things like that. And I'm all for having that conversation. I would want the advocates of it to start from the same sort of conceits and position of what I would consider to be realism of the world that we're living in, the consequences of getting into a one-sided, kind of arms control negotiation, limiting ourselves. Like the reason arms control worked between the United States and the Soviet Union such that it did was both sides had nuclear arms.
Yeah. And they weren't giving them up.
Right. I mean, they were limiting their building.
Fundamentally, they weren't like.
Your point is right. They still had nuclear arsenals that could destroy the planet multiple times over. But let's actually have a debate from a position of facts and reality rather than hopes and dreams.
And I think on the other side of this, you have stuff like chemical weapons or like blinding lasers and stuff like that. But those are like, it just seems to me to be a very different category than this like all-purpose technology, which is going to go into everything.
Also true. Also the other little inconvenient fact about chemical weapons is the reason nations engaged in arms limitations for chemical weapons after World War I is that they realized they didn't work very well. You shoot mustard gas at the trench, over across you, and the wind changes and it blows it all back into the faces of your own soldiers. So there was an incentive for these countries to limit weapons that they themselves had developed, had used, and found to be not as effective as they had thought. So again, there's a realism governing why they engaged in these kinds of arms control in the first place. But to be very clear, they built them, they used them, and only then did they engage in a limitation. Now,
It's like cluster bombs are back, landmines are back. I mean, it's like you don't use the thing until you decide it's.
Yeah, I mean, you don't use those things until you realize that you need them, right? I mean, ask the Ukrainians about landmines, cluster munitions, or area, kind of area destruction type capabilities. Like, they absolutely have a need for them. Like, what is the easiest way to clear a minefield? Right? It's not driving like robotic bulldozers through it. It's like hitting it with a cluster bomb. And that's the kind of thing that, and again, I think for a long time we had this luxury. We took this, kind of vacation from world history, and we thought that we had somehow gotten beyond all of the lessons that we had learned in previous wars and previous experience. And we thought that we could do without this, or we would never need to produce at the scale that we did in the past. And here we are, back to the future.
Speaking about lessons from world history, you mentioned you were reading 1453, an account of the Ottoman siege of Constantinople by Roger Cowley. Very well written, I may say. What struck me was the story of Orban, who's this mercenary gun master. He was from like Hungary or like Wallachia or something.
I still want to know if he's related to President Orban.
Well,
complicated.
Perhaps. So he first goes to the Byzantines. The Byzantines are too poor. So he goes across the river, hangs out with Mehmet, who signs a big contract. He makes the biggest gun the world has ever seen. It was this cannon that shot 700-pound rocks. It was able to knock down this wall that has been, improved upon over the course of 2,000 years. Mehmet, the conqueror, says, keep shooting it, keep shooting it. Orban's like, I see these cracks, maybe we shouldn't. And it eventually blows up and kills him. What lessons does this story have for the future of defense acquisition?
Pay attention to the limitations of your technology. No, your point is right. I mean, it's
skin in the game.
Maybe to take a step back. Why am I reading this book? I've been on this weird, kind of Middle Ages kick for the past couple of years, because I find that, we do as a country an incredibly terrible job teaching history to kids. I have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, soon to be a 13 and a 16-year-old. And it is just shocking how bad their historical education is. So I find myself in, the many other hats that I wear at Anduril and out in the world, also needing to be a history teacher to my children. And it's just frustrating because history is like literally the written record of the most interesting stuff that's ever happened. It's like, how can teachers make this boring? Like, what are we doing wrong? And, what I've found in my own, look, my dad was a historian. I'm not a history major. I'm not a trained historian. I'm just interested.
What was his period?
He studied and wrote on, actually very germane to this conversation, changes in technology, but very specifically, 19th and 20th century Europe with a focus on Germany. So I actually wrote a very cool book called The Kaiser's Army, which is how the German military effectively learned all of the wrong lessons from Franco-Prussian and Austro-Prussian War, and that really didn't set them up well for the beginning, kind of opening days and weeks and months of World War I. You can find it on Amazon. It's not a bestseller, but it's a phenomenal read. In any event, what I've found in my own just reading is like the Middle Ages is just this quote unquote dark age that everyone just kind of consigns to the past. They, read about the Greeks and the Romans. And then they kind of pick things back up with the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and all of those interesting things. But there's this like 1,000-year period where everyone's like, yeah, some stuff happened. There was like wars and plagues and barbarians. I don't really know, like Christianity, crusades, yada, yada, yada. And then the Renaissance like brought us into modernity. So anyway, I've been reading about all of this period because I find it fascinating. And to answer your question, yeah, I think there's a phenomenally interesting through line about the siege of Constantinople that has everything to do with technology and innovation. Orban's guns being a great example of it. I mean, the Ottomans and the Arabs before them had broken their teeth on the walls of Theodosius for years and centuries. And the reason Constantinople was able to survive, despite the Byzantine Empire was able to survive despite being in like a protracted state of decadence, was because they were surrounded by water on three sides and these impregnable walls on the other. So yeah, the recognition that this innovation existed to really start smashing through these walls was phenomenal. And then, beyond that, I mean, just the innovation in, what Mehmet was able to do, like literally dragging his fleet, out of the water over the mountains and bringing it down into the Golden Horn. I mean, it's phenomenal. I traveled to Istanbul a lot of times in my last job with Senator McCain, and I regret that I only appreciate all of the sort of history now in retrospect, and I'm very eager to go back and take my kids because it's a phenomenal city. The history is phenomenal. Just everything about it is just massively interesting to me.
There's a really good military museum, actually. Well, but it has the chain. It has cannons.
A painting of the whole Siege.
It has like a 270 degree
I've been
thing.
there. I just I wish that I had been able to see it with an appreciation that I now have of just all of the ins and outs of what happened in 1453. Anyway, I'll be back. I'll go back. I'm eager to see it and just kind of appreciate it.
I was there on my honeymoon. I was told my wife, like, can I just get one day to look at the war stuff? She's like, okay.
Did you hike the wall, like the Theodosian Wall? I mean, it's
you can walk on the side,
places.
inside. I mean,
it's wild.
And then the amount of stuff is incredible. Like you have some Roman stuff, you got the Byzantines, just a little bit of Roman stuff. And you got the Byzantine stuff, and you got the and then the the mosques are spectacular. Like Hagia Sophia is like overcrowded and a bit much, but like the tier 2 mosques, you have this like experience of serenity of being one of 10 people and like just.
But it's so fast. I mean, you mentioned the Romans. It's fascinating to me. Everybody thinks 476, like the Roman Empire just disappeared. It's like, no, it actually went on for another 1,000 years in Constantinople. For much of that period of time, they would have said like, yeah, we're Rome. So it's an incredibly interesting period of time, and then everything that sort of kind of happens around that, and after that, I don't know. I've taken some weird interest in it. I'm not sure exactly why, but I'll move on, and a different interest will strike my fancy.
More canon lore. The psychological effects of the artillery bombardment on the defenders were even more severe than its material consequences. The noise and vibration of the massed guns, clouds of smoke, and shattering impact on stone dismayed seasoned defenders. To the civilian population, it seemed a glimpse of the coming apocalypse. Which one of your platforms is most likely to give us a glimpse of the coming apocalypse?
I don't think that we will be giving anybody a glimpse of the apocalypse. We're certainly not building anything on the order of.
You got to aim higher, man. I'm a little disappointed in that answer.
But to the question of like striking fear into the hearts of our adversaries, I think the work that we're doing undersea, we're building a large diameter and an extra large diameter autonomous undersea vehicle. Have a phenomenal partner and program in Australia, working with the Australian Navy on that. That is an incredibly cool and deeply scary system. I mean, it's electric powered, it's super silent. It can show up in places that are a long, long way away from where it went into the water. It's wildly accurate. Carries all kinds of very interesting cash and prizes. That is, to me, the kind of offsetting advantage that I would hope gives our adversaries pause, helps to sort of generate and regenerate deterrence in terms of just them waking up every morning and thinking, this isn't the kind of day that I want to, make a run at, a U.S. ally or partner or a U.S. interest or, something else that we value.
Okay, weird one. We've got mass precision. We've got precise mass. I have this vision of mass intimacy. So look, AI is coming. We talk to it all the time.
Yeah.
And it is growing into less of just like Microsoft Word and more of a companion to lots and lots of people. It's like the espionage and like the social engineering power that you could have by controlling like a decent percentage of like a nation state's therapists or spouses, or best friends just seems like wild. And I don't know, just as scary as a secret silent submarine.
Absolutely. And I mean, these are the kinds of things that sound like science fiction. They sound far-fetched, right? But then you start kind of putting the pieces together. So let's say, hypothetically, right, that an adversary of the United States, stole an enormous amount of classified information about, people in the United States government who hold security clearances. May have happened. So they have a deep knowledge of, who people are, kind of personal information about them. Let's say they have an active cyber campaign and operation to gather more of that information. And then they can basically build, an AI agent that is capable of identifying and making contact with a person and over a period of time becoming intimate with them, such that that person begins divulging information about themselves that is compromising. Um, this isn't crazy at all. I would be surprised if it isn't happening, or if it isn't something that foreign adversaries are seeking to do to the United States in terms of how you put that type of an operation together in terms of the information and intelligence gathering, the targeting, the technology, to go after not large scale Orban cannon style warfare, but incredibly precise, very strategically important, highly consequential types of operations that previously would never have really been possible. This is here now, right? I mean, to your point about our increasingly intimate relationship with AI and AI agents. I mean, it's only going to become more that way, and the kind of nefarious kind of weaponization that is possible with those types of things. Like, I don't even think we've cracked the surface in terms of the level of creativity that people are going to put against this.
Yeah, I mean, like, would I rather have an SF-86 or someone's ChatGPT logs? Like the ChatGPT log every time. The SF-86, it's a point in time, right? And it's like everything you are willing to tell the government.
Sure.
But like, your whatever problems you have in your life, real time, you are engaging with technology with those things nowadays.
Yep.
And by the way, 30% of the US AI companion market is currently owned by Chinese companies. So
Yeah.
we'll see how that one plays out. I don't know. I also think it's more than just the, like, if you're worried, if you think TikTok is kind of sketchy, like, I think there's a bigger worry than just like getting the assistant secretary of whatever's stuff. Like, you can do societal level things.
Totally agree.
Which are,
And it is absolutely a both and. I think it's more that, people have become familiar with, more so familiar with the threats that a platform like TikTok poses, or sort of deep Chinese involvement in the American technological base and sort of access to, all of us in our day-to-day lives, data that we're, feeding into these systems. When you then start to think about things that most Americans don't think about or don't have a lot of experience with, right, in terms of how this changes intelligence gathering, intelligence operations, cultivating assets, compromise. It's an incredibly powerful tool because, to your point, the amount of information that we're putting out into the digital environment, our willingness to just kind of become intimate with some system that understands us at a very deep level and understands how to sort of, dig into the things about us that, we may only want to share with someone in an environment of intimacy, but it's there and they know what to look for. Like, that's all pretty terrifying.
what's the book that needs to be written? What would the Kill Chain sequel look like? New chapters?
It's a good question. I mean, I do get asked a lot if I'm working on another book. My experience of writing the Kill Chain was like pretty uniformly awful. I was working full time at Anduril. I mean, I have a wife and 2 kids. I was not looking to be an absentee husband or parent. So I was basically doing this in my free time. And it was also then on incredibly, at least what I would consider to be an aggressive schedule, from like first blinking cursor to final copy shipped in like 10 months or so. So like pretty much the entire experience was just pain and suffering. And I am fortunate that I don't have to write for a living. So it's a long way of saying I am not currently working on another book. I'm a first-time author, and I'm probably going to look to keep it that way. Maybe never say never. There's something that I think that I have to say. Maybe I'll say it in the future. But I mean, what's the book that needs to be written on this kind of subject? There's plenty. I guess to me, it's look, it's whether it's my book or countless others that are better, and articles and speeches and other things. Like, we've said all these things, right? I mean, so much has been said. It kind of goes back to the beginning of the conversation about seriousness. I think we know what the problems are. I think we know what's wrong. I think we have a increasingly clear-eyed view of the threat and the consequences of not changing. Um, I think that Washington, D.C. gets very kind of caught up in questions of process. And we tend to mistake changing a process for inherently leading to a better outcome. So, JSIDS was just, consigned to the history books. We're better off for it. But nobody should think that just because we did away with a process means that we're inherently going to get better outcomes. I would submit, and I'm prepared to be challenged on this, that we have absolutely everything that we need to do the kinds of things that we're saying we need to do. We have all of the authorities we need. We have plenty of money. We have phenomenal people in government, out of government. We have world-leading technology. There's nothing that we are missing. There's not a process or budgetary or other type of roadblock that's standing in our way. I believe we are fundamentally limited only by our own level of imagination, will, and seriousness to conceive of new capabilities and new ways of then organizing and operating as a result of them and bringing them into the world with the quickness. That is just a matter of senior leaders making their institutions do new and different things rapidly. That is absolutely something that we have the power to do. There's nothing that is standing in our way to doing that. So it's not to say that more books don't need to be written or articles or podcasts. I mean, I think it's important to keep people focused on this, but I guess the main point I would bring it back to is there's nothing stopping us. And I think that too often people almost want to believe that, well, unless we reform the procurement process or change the budget process or fix, the amount of money that the Department of Defense is getting, we won't be able to change. And I think that it's almost a bit of a cop out. And I think that it's actually scarier when people realize, oh, wait, actually, I have everything that I need to do all of the things that I say are important, which begs the question, well, what are you going to do? And look, I mean, we're just, I'm one person, we're one company. We're doing the things that we can do. I'm doing the things that I can do kind of at my level. I think the good news is that there are a lot of people in government who are becoming serious, who want to make these kinds of changes. I just want them to know that there's nothing standing in their way to doing the things they believe are important.
I feel like not a lot of people would agree with you. Why do you believe that?
For a lot of reasons. I mean, I've been doing this long enough that I've participated in a lot of reform of these processes. I know a lot of the authorities that exist. I mean, in the many years that I was over in the Senate, we literally produced hundreds of pages of acquisition reform. I'm not even sure how much of those reforms were even needed when you look at the massive amount of flexibility that does exist for the government to acquire the things that it wants. Oftentimes, it comes down to a question of political will. You could use that authority to do that thing. It's risky. It's hard. Someone won't like it. Someone might protest. That doesn't mean that you can't do it. Your hands aren't tied. I think that too much of our defense, kind of world is kind of overly reliant on this priesthood of people who claim to have magical knowledge of the procurement system and what you can and can't do with budgets. And senior leaders have kind of disempowered themselves. A lawyer says, well, you're not allowed to do that. To which my question would be like, literally show me the section of statute or law that says that I can't. And if you can't show it to me, then my assumption is that I can. I think that my experience is we have an enormous amount of authority to do the kinds of things that we're talking about, creating new programs, putting new technology into the field, scaling it up. I don't think that it's debatable that we have talent and technology in this country. And when you talk about money, I mean, we're spending the better part of $1 trillion on national defense annually. And I would argue you should be able to build a pretty damn good military for $1 trillion. So I'm not sitting here saying like we just need to cancel all of our traditional programs of record to make space for the new things. I think you have to do both. We need the traditional, the legacy, the exquisite, the expensive. We also need the new, the non-traditional, the low cost, the mass producible. I believe we have the budget to do all of it. And what's worse is if we don't do it and we keep trying to, plow more money into the programs that have existed for a very long time, we will spend all of our money. We will not get a significant increase in production capacity or capability, and we will only put ourselves at greater risk in the future.
The reason things are not happening, I guess, might come down to this like very moving end of the kill chain, where you talked about John McCain, who you worked for a long time, passing, and like how dejected you felt. A quote: "This same pessimism occupied me on my third occasion when my emotions about McCain overwhelmed me. It was an overcast and unseasonably cold October morning in Annapolis, Maryland, where McCain's final resting place lies in a small cemetery on the coast of Chesapeake Bay at the U.S. Naval Academy. It was the first time I had been back to his grave since his death, and it did not take long for all those old memories, emotions, and feelings of gratitude to come rushing back. But what was different this time was the overwhelming sense of sadness at the inescapable realization that things in Washington had not gotten any better since McCain's passing. Indeed, they had gotten worse, significantly, inexplicably, undeniably worse."
That was what I felt at the time. Yeah, and maybe to put some context around it, when McCain passed, I had this hope, and it was primarily when we were sitting at the National Cathedral at his funeral, that maybe this would help to kind of galvanize a critical mass of people to say, hey, this guy had worked for literally decades to try to make these processes better, to try to make the DoD better, to make programs perform better. Ultimately to get our warfighters the capabilities they need to deter conflict and win. And maybe his passing and the realization, of his absence would force people to really get their act together, right? To stop, fighting over the budget, to stop with the continuing resolutions and the threats of government shutdowns and, all of the things that end up being incredibly costly and time wasting distractions from the actual business of getting down to arming our warfighters with what they're going to need and the timelines that they're going to need them. And there's a part of me that knew at the time that wasn't right, and that wasn't going to be the case. Just because working in politics as long as I had, there's a hard outer layer of cynicism that you build up. And yeah, like when I went back up and visited his gravesite, a year or so later, it was that same realization of like, man, there was this hope, this moment that maybe we could have had, where everyone was united, everyone realized and was kind of reflecting on this guy's legacy and what he did. And he wasn't perfect, but he was way better than the rest. And just to hope that maybe that would lead us to be more serious and make hard decisions. Because the thing that I get asked about a lot with McCain, what was it like working for him? What was different about him? The thing about McCain that I always appreciated is that there are plenty of smart people in Washington. There are tons of decent people. There are tons of hardworking people. There aren't a lot of courageous people. There aren't a lot of people who are willing to take an action or a decision knowing that it is going to blow back on them, knowing that despite it being the right thing to do, they are going to suffer an immediate, political or other type of consequence for their action. I don't see that a lot. And that's kind of, I think, what these times call for. And just kind of hoping that, maybe, just maybe, people would be a little more willing to be a bit more courageous when it comes to taking the hard votes or making the hard decisions that frankly allow us to function like a normal country, right? I mean, we're talking about, like, we've defined deviancy down to such an extent. We're basically trying to get back to normal and regular order. So maybe we could have the courage to do that. Yeah, and it was a pretty depressing, albeit entirely foreseeable realization that we had in fact not done that. I think at the time that I wrote it, I mean, all of the political uncertainty and volatility and fighting was worse even than it had been when I left the Senate, which was already at a high dudgeon. And yeah, I would submit here we are 5 years and change later. I do think there are a lot of bright spots, a lot of things you can point to that look like they could be, the kind of direction of progress and how we get out of this. But again, it comes down to what people say is interesting. What people do actually matters. And until we start doing more of the things that we say we need to do and not doing these unserious and very detrimental things that frankly end up tying the hands of our warfighters, tying the hands of the Department of Defense, to do the very things that we rely upon them to do as a country, it's hard for me to believe that we've reached a level of seriousness that I think John McCain would be happy with.
So, I mean, we got a lot of youth who listen to this show. I think a good number of them have like very little living memory of McCain on the 2008 campaign. And the one thing that is really going to remain with me is that he could have run that campaign very differently. And in a way that may have given him a better chance of winning and deciding not to take America to a dark place at that moment in time, I think is like, what else do you want to share about McCain for the kids?
Well, and I think a lot of people remember, and for those who don't, they should go back and watch his concession speech, right? Which itself is an interesting thing that happened. But the way that he conceded at a time where people didn't want him to concede, where they wanted to continue to fight, they wanted all of these things. I mean, it's an incredibly moving statement, and very much about what needs to happen in the aftermath of an election that is clearly settled in one direction, right? Of it's time to move on. It's time to kind of unify as a country and go solve the real problems that matter, right? We've fought over our differences. Now it's time to focus on governing and moving into the future. What else was phenomenal about McCain? I mean, I had such an amazing, like, absolutely unique experience working for the guy. I mean, I lost count, probably over 100 countries that we visited. And the wonderful thing about him was, I mean, he would set an absolute breakneck pace. I mean, we just would kill people on the trips that he did, 7 countries in 6 days, managing to make the logistics close in just like, an absolute, hair's breadth. The thing that was always cool was that he would do all the meetings, he would do all the work, but he always left time to do something fun and interesting and generally, culturally and historically significant. So, mentioned the many trips we made to Istanbul, saw a lot of amazing history in that city. Went to Mongolia with, had a long meeting with the president of Mongolia, who then invited us to go fishing out in the Mongolian steppe. Sailed down the river, or, paddled down the river with his security detail and, caught fish. It was always stuff like that it's like, I've sat in a lot of meetings in my time in government, meetings are meetings, and, whether you're working for this principle or that principle, they're kind of, not wildly different. It's those experiences that McCain always sought out to do something interesting, to see something significant, to go to a place that he'd read about and see in person. Places that I know that I'll never go back to. It's just incredibly I feel incredibly fortunate that I got to do that with a person like that.
Maybe last one for you. What's the more ambitious version of China Talk? What can I be doing better or bigger?
It's a good question. I think what you're doing is so important and phenomenal, and I appreciate, again, for those of us who are not as expert in China, who don't spend as much time thinking about it. I mean, it's a phenomenal service and resource. The diversity of guests you bring on, the focus and kind of deep level of insight that you provide. What's bigger and better? I don't know. You could get a primetime talk show. You could expand from China to Russia. I mean, I don't think these are things that you necessarily want to do. But I think, no, I think what you're doing is terrific. And honestly, I wouldn't mess with it because it's working.
Okay. Chris Brose, thanks so much for being part of China Talk.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
I can't pretend to be a great celebrity, but still I'm quite important in my way. The job I have to do may not sound much to you, but all the same I'm very proud to say I'm the girl that makes the thing that drills the hole that holds the ring that drives the rod that turns the knob that works the thingamabob. I'm the girl that makes the thing that holds the oil that oils the ring that takes the shank that moves the crank that works the thingamabob. It's a ticklish sort of job, making a thing for a thingamabob. at all. I don't suppose you'd even know my name. But though I'll never boast of my important post, I'll strike a blow for freedom just the same. That works the thingamabob. That works the thingamabob. It's a ticklish sort of job, making a thing for a thingamabob, especially when you don't know what it's for. But it's the girl that makes the thing, that drills the hole, that holds the ring, that makes the thingamabob, that makes the engines roar. And it's the girl that makes the thing, that holds the oil, that oils the ring, that makes the thingamabob that's going to win the war. It isn't all.